Hi, I'm Dave Whitefield. I help organisations tackle safety and risk through a specific focus on culture and people. And in this video, I'm going to talk about problems and how we think about problems can help us change the way we're approaching some of the things we do with safety and risk. So why do I think we need to maybe change? Well, here's a question I ask at the beginning of nearly every workshop I run. Can we do things in the name of safety that can unintentionally increase risk? Can we do things in the name of safety that can unintentionally increase risk? That's a question I ask. And basically the most common answer is yes, we can, right? That's the overwhelming response I get. And if I say, can you think of any examples? People readily come up with examples. It's usually over systemizing, too many rules, too many regulations, too many controls, too many barriers, too much PPE, whatever it is. So what this sort of tells me is people don't object to the principle of managing risk and safety. It's that we go too far. And so given that everyone says, for me, my experience, is that the majority of people I talk to say it can happen and can give examples of how it happens. Why are we stuck in this cycle? Why can't we get out of it? Well, I think there is some interesting insight to be gained by talking about wicked problems. It helps, and by wicked problems I'm talking about, this is a body of work. Wicked problems is not something I've made up. This is a body of work that was first developed in the late 60s and 70s out of the US. I think there are some interesting principles that can be applied to safety and risk that help us understand this unintentional negative impact where we're increasing risk, but also give us some practical takeaways about how to tackle that and how to deal with that. So let's go through wicked problems first, just to set up the nature of what we're talking about here. So wicked problems, the easiest way to talk about it is the idea of describing problems on a spectrum and saying we're going to start with simple problems down the far left-hand side here and say that simple problems get fixed. Then I'd usually say, what's the opposite of simple? And people say complex. And I'm like, well, because I'm being me today, sorry about this, I'm going to put complex in the middle, right? So complex problems sit in the middle. Just trust me, that says complex. Sorry, it's pretty bad writing. The good news is complex problems can be solved. And that's what a lot of technical people have to do, is solve complex problems. But what this is about is the next kind of key question. The first one was, can we unintentionally increase risk? The second one is, how do you feel about the idea there are problems that can't be fixed or solved? There are problems that might be unsolvable. I get a variety of responses here when I ask this and I go through this process. First of all, I'm not trying to teach anything new. I'm just trying to give language and structure to some stuff that already exists. So some people are like, yeah, of course there are problems that we'll never ever solve. Other people are already thinking further down the track going, well, hang on a minute, but we can't give up. And aren't you just talking about like compromise? And yeah, basically that's all I'm talking about. It's just that if we think about this as safety and risk, does this help us understand some of these unintended consequences? So in this model, what it's saying is there are problems that are further down the track here, and these are called wicked problems. So the language is quite emotive, but it meant to be like it defies solving sort of thing, and wicked problems get tackled. So it also introduces another kind of bit of language around how we deal with these types of problems. So again, so what, right? I've just named something. Now, by the way, wicked problems are just uber complex problems. You know, it's not that they're just a special type. It's just that there's so many moving parts. They're intractable. They exist in areas where this is the technical stuff. There's high social diversity and issue fragmentation. Lots of different people who can't even agree on what the problem is. I mean, that'd never exist in safety, right? So it's just naming something that exists. You can describe it in other ways of, complexity theory or chaos theory, but it just is uber complex, and it means we'll never reach a final solution. Now, the next question though is, could we run into issues if we're dealing with something that's a wicked problem that is unsolvable, but treating it as if it's solvable? That's really at the crux of where I think we end up with this unintended negative impact of increasing risk. Could we sort of be treating things as if they're solvable, but they're actually unsolvable? Which then leads to, how do you feel about the idea that safety and risk are wicked problems? You probably sense that's where we're going, right? So I think they meet the criteria. I think safety, risk, culture, customer service, town planning, politics, healthcare, social reform, welfare, they're all wicked problems. They're all things that just defy a single solution, yet we can't give up on, right? And that's basically where Wicked Problems thinking and strategies came from, was we need ways of dealing with these intractable problems that don't have a solution. And that's really what I'm going to talk about. Is there's, I think, first of all, value in going, yes, there are such things as wicked problems. Second, safety and risk are wicked problems. And therefore, we need to be careful how we treat them. We need to be careful we're not treating them as if we're solvable. Now, what does it sound like when safety, particularly safety, is treated as being solvable? Well, 0 would be an outcome of that. If you're aspiring to or set it as an actual target, whatever it is, but if you associate 0 with safety, 0 harm, you must think you can solve it. That's an inevitable outcome, right? If your reaction to incidents and events is always correction, that is, there's no tolerance for just, we don't know what happened and we don't think we need to correct it. If you're always correcting, we always must need a bit more, something else, more, even if, by the way, it's more supervision or more attention. But in practical terms, that first question I ask about unintentionally increasing risk, it's because we want more systems, more training, more process, because we think there's a solution. Now, we didn't start out with that, and I'm not banging on here about traditional sort of orthodox or safety 1 or safety 2. I'm saying hazard management is a foundation of safety, but can only go so far. Systems are a foundation. Systems do help manage risk, formal systems, but only so far. And I think what happens in traditional safety management approaches is we struggle seeing that endpoint. And so I think wicked problems theory gives us some mechanics to think about that. Now, the other thing I'll say is another example of what this sounds like is literally people asking for solutions or fixes. So companies saying, can you come and fix this? Well, how do we solve this? How do we fix fatigue? How do we solve fatigue? Whatever it might be. And by the way, consultants selling it. So, if we're selling a solution, then we're implying that it can be solved. Even if that's not what we meant, it's all part of perpetuating what's happening in the industry at the moment. So I think that safety and risk are wicked problems. And then if we look at, well, so what, right? Let's look at just 4 things. By the way, this is a really big body of work. I'm going to pick just 4 elements that I think are interesting takeaways. So one of the things that sits in wicked problems is this idea of a stopping rule. Now, this is because it's a wicked problem, so there is no final solution. So you have to choose a stopping point, or another way of saying is there is no stopping point. So you need to choose one. Now, that's very difficult in safety. So I've spent time in other videos banging on about why I think the language of safety doesn't serve us and why I think organizations get more value from focusing on risk. So in safety, if I said what's safe enough, it's a really challenging question to answer. And it's often how we end up back at 0 or with injury targets, right? So basically leave safety alone and say, well, our job here is to tackle risk or to manage risk, right? So if you focus on risk and then say, is there a stopping point, right? Is there a stopping rule? Is there a point where we go, this is safe, or sorry, this is risky, an acceptable level of risk, or we've managed enough risk? Sorry, I'm leading us to the answer there. And basically that's what ALARP or AFARP, as low as reasonably practicable, as far as reasonably practicable, is about. And where do we get that from? Well, it comes from legislation. Legislation accepts that safety is a wicked problem. It does not require you to avoid all harm. It requires you to manage risk as far as reasonably practicable. And you get tested on that and you get interrogated very strongly on it. But it doesn't tell you you've got to eliminate all risk or eliminate all harm. So what I'm actually saying here is that adopting this framework really as an integral, embracing it, right, actually allows you to be more consistent, because many of you would have ALARP or AFARP in your risk management processes, yet get anchored to solving safety as a broader outcome, your policy or the way you react to incidents or in the language you use. So this is about being internally consistent with our job here is to tackle risk. How much? As far as reasonably practicable. And then we need to be super confident that we're doing that. Okay, so that's a really key bit. Another example, and this is a practical thing that we're already doing, is the idea of boundary objects. So just because you've got lots of different people with lots of different worldviews or approaches, we use boundary objects. A risk matrix would be an example, a classic example in safety of a boundary object, because it's like we've got all these different people with different views on what risk is about, but we're all going to use this risk matrix to at least talk about it. So that's a great example of boundary object. Safety and risk already does this, maybe too many of them, but I'm just saying we're actually already doing this, a lot of this stuff. That's why It's not so much me saying, hey, guess what, safety is a wicked problem. It's more saying, what can we do with it if we actually treat it that way? How can we use this to our advantage and help us understand some of those unintended consequences? A third one I want to talk about here is this idea of no do-overs. No mulligans is the way I often described it. That's an S on the end. That's a golfing term. I'm not a golfer, but I know it's a term. Basically, it means a mulligan is when you get to take a shot and do it again. Now, in safety, the idea is, in wicked problems, and for those of you who know a lot about wicked problems, I'm about to fudge to, but essentially, everything you do is on the back of everything you've done. So there's no do-overs there. You can't just start from scratch, but also everything you do is a one shot. And you don't know if it's worked. There's no actual solutions here. So it's no right or wrong. It's just, you got to do it and something will happen and then you do something else. So the way as I said, I'm combining, some of you know I've combined a few there, but what this means practically for me is when you start focusing on culture and people, which is the work I help organizations with, we don't call it anything. We don't make it a program or an initiative. And that's partly because organizations and people within them are mostly initiatived out. And when you announce a new program, they're rarely excited. They're normally worried about what extra work. It's like, oh no, not again. So literally, you just start doing things. You start talking differently. You start running workshops. You start getting better engagement. You shift the language to tackle, right? You just start changing it. Also, you can't measure it through traditional outcomes of what's this going to result in? Oh, is this going to make us safer? It's like, well, there's no such thing, right? So you're not going to get a return on investment that's always measurable. You're not going to get a reduction in injury rates. In tackling wicked problems is what I'm saying here is you just need to be careful about the outcomes because you don't know if it's worked or not. It just might have made a difference. The final thing is a sort of more cultural, but it's linking this idea of tackle, which is an important language. So I love the idea of tackling because it implies we're still going. It's never a perfect solution. And the question here is actually better to think that we've never got this fully under control, that safety is never fully under control, or is it better to think that we have got it under control? And I would argue it's better to think it's never fully under control. We don't want people pessimistic, but we want people more awake to potential problems. And I think this has got a really close alignment with the idea of chronic unease, which sits heavily in the high reliability organising space. HROing, high reliability organisations are not about systemising to see things. It's about characteristics, cultural characteristics and traits that make you better at seeing potential issues and responding better. And I think the whole language of tackling safety and risk enables that and supports it in a practical way. It means if you ever heard somebody in your business say, oh yeah, we've fixed that or we've solved it, you'd be like, wait a minute, tell me more about that. Now, by the way, some safety problems, when you break them down, there's another strategy in here of chunking down. You chunk problems down into smaller areas rather than trying to tackle safety. So, some things you can actually solve. I get that. And you can do engineering controls with to solve them. But it's that testing thing of like, what is this actually a solution or are we just tackling it? Just to make sure you're clear on it. The chunking down, by the way, is another example of a strategy I help organizations with, whereas instead of trying to tackle safety, you break it down into inputs like communication, trust, care, systems, people, support, training, education. You break it right down. It's much more complex, but it's more meaningful. And then sometimes with that, you're solving that problem potentially, but most of it's still just tackling from there. So thanks for listening to the video and making it this far. If you did, welcome any comments or theories. As I said, I just think there's some really interesting ideas about embracing wicked problems that help us understand some of the sort of unintended trade-offs we've created, but also gives us some way forward. So I hope to see you in another video. Thanks.